Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from more people who were concerned with the lifts at Grenfell Tower. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Mayor called Gary Poynter.
Good morning, Mr. Poynter.
Morning.
You're going to make the affirmation, I think.
I have.
Well, the words are there on the screen in front of you. Would you read them, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, do sit down, make yourself comfortable. There's water there if you'd like some.
Yep. Thank you.
All right.
Yep.
Yes, Mr. Kinnear, when you're ready.
Thanks, sir. Would you please confirm your name for the record?
Gary Lee Poynter.
Mr. Poynter, thank you for attending today. Three things before we start. First of all, if at any time during the examination you require a break, please say so. That's not a problem. Secondly, if you would please keep your voice up. That's to enable the shorthand writer to capture everything you say and capture it accurately. Also, please don't nod, say yes or no as the case may be, so she can capture it. Finally, my questions are intended to be short. If they're not or they're not clear, please say so and I'll rephrase them. Now, you provided one statement for this inquiry and we can find it at APX *08766 and it's dated the 30th of October 2019. Is that your statement?
That is my statement.
Have you read it recently?
I have.
And can you confirm the contents are true?
They are true.
Thank you. Now, if I can turn first of all to your employment background, is it right that you began work in the lifts industry in 1980 at Stanner Lifts?
Correct.
And that you qualified as a lift engineer in 1983?
Correct.
And that you worked for two different lift companies in the 1980s before moving to Apex in 1996 as a repairs manager?
That is correct.
And that you were later promoted to the position of construction manager?
Correct.
And that was a role you held during the course of the Grenfell Tower project?
That's right.
And since 2006 onwards, you have worked as a construction director, is that right?
That is correct.
Thank you. Now, could I turn to your qualifications now, just by way of background? First of all, you have completed the J5 and J26 modules, which are lift engineer qualifications, is that right?
That is correct.
And that you've completed distance learning courses held by the National Association of Lift Makers, and it's levels 1, 2, 3 and 4, is that right?
That is correct.
Excuse me. Now, if we can turn to training matters, in your role as construction director, would you be expected to have knowledge of the relevant British and European standards as they apply to lifts?
We would.
And over the course of your career, did you receive any training on the requirements of British standards or European standards insofar as they relate to lifts?
Yeah, we've attended seminars.
And would you have attended seminars before you started work on the Grenfell project?
Probably, yes.
Now, looking back, if you can do, to the period 2003-2004, did you receive training on the principles and requirements of BS 5588-5 1991, which concerned fire precautions in the design, construction of use of buildings, Part 5, Code of Practice for Firefighting Stairs and Lifts?
Not that I can recall.
Nonetheless, were you familiar with the detailed requirements of that standard?
Some.
Which requirements were you most familiar with?
5655.
And for the uninitiated, what did that consider?
That was the lift regulations at the time.
Thank you. Did you receive any training, and this is looking at 2003 and 2004 again, did you receive training on the principles and requirements of BS EN 8172 2003?
We'd have had some seminar training, yes.
And would you have been familiar with the relevant requirements of that standard?
I would have been.
Did you have ready access at the time to the standards themselves, hard copies, so you could consult them if necessary?
Yes, they would have been available in the office.
Did you receive any training on the changes brought in by the revision to BS 5588-5 1991, which were published in 2004?
Probably, but I can't remember.
Nonetheless, were you familiar with the changes that were brought into practice? And again, would you have had ready access to a hard copy of that standard?
Yes, they would have been available.
Finally, did you receive any training on the statutory guidance document that's known as Approved Document B?
Not that I can recall.
No. Are you familiar at all with Approved Document B?
No.
Now, in relation to firefighting lifts themselves, did you receive any other training on the design requirements of a firefighting lift?
No.
Did you receive any training, for example, on the types of buildings in which a firefighting lift would be required by standards?
We would have received training, yes.
And again, would that have been provided by Apex, for example?
Probably by our body from Leah.
Leah, and if you could just inform the panel, I know what Leah stands for, but if you could tell the panel.
The Lift Industry Associations is our body.
Now, if I could ask you one final question, did you receive any other training on the purposes and functions of a firefighting lift?
Not that I can recall now.
Now, looking at the particular perspective of high-rise buildings, in your statement, we don't need to go to it, but it can be found at it's the answer E to question 11, which can be found at APX quadruple 08766/12. You said this: I have never worked on a project in a high-rise residential building where I was asked to replace existing lifts and install firefighting lifts. I have, however, carried out work, overseen work, where firefighting lifts were installed in new builds. Now, have you ever worked on a project involving a high-rise building where lifts were installed with some features of the firefighting lift, but not all?
No, we would either do all or none. So new build have firefighting lifts as standards when they're required. Existing lifts and still are not carried out to this standard.
Can you help the panel? Why is the approach all or nothing?
The testers wouldn't be able to sign the job off as complete as firefighting. It wouldn't comply.
And so the preference would be
To comply fully.
to have all the aspects
Correct.
of a firefighting lift.
Correct.
Mr. Poynter, there's a understandable temptation to give the answer as soon as possible. If you just wait for the question to finish,
Okay.
It's just that the shorthand writer can capture everything. Now, if I can turn to a different issue, which is the relationship between RBKC, TMO and Butler and Young. Now, before the Grenfell project, had you carried out any previous projects yourself for RBKC?
We have worked for RBKC, but I'm not sure if the Town Hall project was before or after Grenfell, so I can't remember that far back, but yes.
Did any involve high-rise residential buildings?
No,
Had you worked with the TMO before the Grenfell project?
only on the Town Hall project.
In your experience, did the relevant staff at the TMO have the requisite knowledge of the standards and what they required?
From my recollection, they would, but we would have dealt more with Butler and Young than RBKC.
Did you have any direct dealings with anyone from the TMO, for example, David Steppel or Robin Callan?
No.
Now, if we could just go to a name, and this is just to clarify matters in your statement. We go to APX quadruple 08766/6, and the answer to question 6. And you see there, in the answer, 2 names down, you refer to someone called Robin Callahan.
Callan.
Is it Callan it's meant to be?
Sorry.
Thank you. Had you worked with Butler and Young before you started work with them on this Grenfell project?
Yes, we had.
How many occasions can you remember now?
There was many.
And did any of those projects concern high-rise residential buildings?
Not high-rise residential.
Did any involve provision of firefighting lifts that you can remember?
None.
Is that none did or none?
None of them had firefighting requirements.
Now, if I can just turn to the relevant standards themselves, and I'll approach it in a slightly broad way to start off with and see how far we go. Now, at the time of this project, in your view, did the relevant standards or any other legislation or guidance require the installation of firefighting lifts in new buildings?
They would have done in new building, but not in existing.
And in your view, or to the best of your recollection, why weren't they required in existing buildings?
Because the buildings themselves didn't lend themselves to be fully compliant with the regulations.
And so, put slightly differently, the general view was, and shout if this is an unfair or inaccurate summary, that it was not reasonably practicable to install full firefighting lifts in existing buildings, and because of that, they weren't.
That is correct.
Now, if I could be grateful for your view in response to a conclusion reached by the inquiries expert, Mr. Roger Howkins, and if we go to RHO quadruple 00003, /118 and paragraph 248. And you see there, in the first sentence of paragraph 248, Mr. Howkins said this: regardless of whether the lifts were considered new or modernised, good practice would have been to consider if the lifts could be fully upgraded to the firefighting standard so far as was reasonably practicable. Would you agree or disagree with that opinion?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Thank you. Now, could I discuss with you the practical consequences of the distinction between lift modernisations and lift replacements in the context of Grenfell? Now, if we could go back to your witness statement, which is at APX /0 8766/8. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. And if we go to the answer to question 9, and you say there in the second paragraph this: I am not clear as to what is meant by the reference to new lifts. No new lifts were installed in this project. This project related to the modernisation of existing lifts, which were firemen's lifts, as specified in accordance with BS 5655. Now, if we could start, first of all, by looking at BS 5655/1 from 1989, which concerned lifts and service lifts, recommendations for the installation of new and modernisation of electric lifts in existing buildings. And that can be found at BSI /0 1728/5. Now, if we can look at section 2.4.1, it's on the right-hand side. And that says, it is assumed that the existing guide rails, so it should be over the page actually, at the top of that page. Sorry, if we go back to the previous page, it's the bottom paragraph, sorry, I misread my note. It says, it is assumed that the existing guide rails and their fixings will be retained, and if necessary extended. Any unsuitable for the new application should be replaced and considered as a new installation in accordance with section 3. Now, would you agree that if the guide rails and fixings were retained, the project should be characterised as a modernisation?
Is correct.
Yeah. Now, if we can stay in this document but go over the page this time, to page 6 and section 3.1. Actually, it's... And what that says there is when a new lift is installed in a new lift well, in association with an existing building, the installation should comply with BS 5655 Part 1. It should preferably comply with the standard dimensions specified in BS 5655 Part 5, i.e. the installation should be considered as being a new lift in a new building. Now, reading that section with section 2.4.1, would you agree that if the guide rails are not retained and the lift is installed in a new lift well, then the installation is new?
It could be new, but it might not be to be confirmed with the standards. There could be restrictions on the pit depth and headrooms, which won't necessarily comply with a new lift. So they would have to be addressed.
So these will be physical constraints of the existing
building.
Structure?
Yes, it would have to comply fully with the regulation to be classed as a new lift and would not be passed off.
And so, your view would be that that caveat is all important in the approach that you take to whether something is modernised or new?
That's correct.
Now, could we look at BS 5655-11/2005, which is Lifts and Service Lifts, Code of Practice for the Undertaking of Modification to Existing Electric Lifts, and that can be found at BSI /0 1724/7. And this part of the standard, and you'll see at it's got section 1 scope, and you look at the second paragraph rather, it says this part of 5655 does not cover any of the following types of lift, new lifts, and it says see note 2. And if we look slightly further down the page at note 2, which is, there we go, thank you, it says this: where a lift falls into one of the following categories, it is deemed to be a new lift as defined in the Lifts Regulations 1997, and this part of 5655 is not applicable. It says lift completely replaced at the third dash, and just below that only retains the guide rails immediately below that. Now that suggests, looking at that standard in the round, that if only the guide rails are retained, the lift should be categorised as a new lift. Looking at what's said there, would you agree with that proposition?
That is correct, yes.
Now, mindful of what that standard says there, can we look at what was actually done at Grenfell, and then I can explore with you your views as to whether it was a new lift or not. Am I right in understanding that the project required an increase in the lift car size and capacity, so from 8 to 12 people?
That is right.
And the project involved the following, and if I can just roll them off and see whether you agree with them or not. The replacement of the complete lift car,
Correct.
the counterweight,
Correct.
the car sling and platform,
Correct.
safety gear,
Correct.
door operator,
Correct.
car doors,
Correct.
landing doors,
Correct.
landing control system,
Correct.
lift pit buffers,
Correct.
electrical wiring,
Correct.
lift controller,
Correct.
and the lift motor gearbox.
Correct.
Now, mindful those are all the matters that were replaced, can we look to see what was retained, and for that purpose go to the specification, and particular BUT quadruple 0 0044/12 and section 1.3.1, which should be at the top of that page. And you'll see there under the heading retained equipment, in relation to the 2 electric passenger lifts, it says guide and single riser of car guide brackets and landing back boxes. Is that a fair summary?
That is correct. Yeah.
Could you help us? Landing back boxes, what are they?
It's the back box fitted within the structure of the building that the landing push stations adhere to. So they're actually fixed into that part of the building structure.
Now, although guides are set out there as having been retained, is it right to say that they were in fact relocated?
They were moved
And where were they moved to?
make the car bigger.
Now, given that they were relocated, would you still take the view that nonetheless they were retained?
They were retained.
And so the fact they were moved around, in your view, is irrelevant when looking to see whether they're new or modernised lifts?
Irrelevant.
And can you help us as to why?
If it goes back to the standards. If it's a new lift, it will be completely new lift installation, and it would have to comply with the current regulations at the time. Existing lifts, more often than not, do not. The pit depths and headroom are the constraints of the new lifts and the sizes given.
Just looking back at this, so looking at retained equipment, the guides were relocated, but in your view, retained.
Yeah.
Were the landing back boxes in fact retained?
They were retained.
Thank you.
These landing back boxes, are they just essentially the bit behind the control panel or the button panel?
Yeah, they because the building I think was concrete from memory, so they would have been cut into the concrete and then set in that concrete. So
It's a big chasing in the concrete.
they would have been chased in many when the building was full.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Looking at the extent of the apparatus that was retained, that was replaced rather, and the limited amount that was retained, was the project an opportunity for the TMO and RBKC to enhance the safety features of these lifts?
It could have been if that was discussed at the time.
Would it have been, in your view, good industry practice to have considered what aspects of a firefighting lift could be included in these new lifts?
No, because you have to either commit fully or not at all. So the idea is not to do it, and still practice today with the boroughs in London.
And so you wouldn't examine, for example, whether it had been practicable to have installed the trapdoor?
No, because of putting the trapdoor create more risks.
Well, that might be true in relation to the trapdoor, but let's take something that wouldn't create a risk. For example, a secondary and separate power supply.
It wouldn't still be classed as a firefighting lift because the tester would have to sign the lift off and it wouldn't comply as a
Right.
fully firefighting lift.
So he couldn't sign it off as a firefighting lift.
No,
He'd have to sign it off as a fireman's lift.
correct.
But would it not be worth, I think this is the thrust of the question, considering whether it would be a fireman's lift with some enhanced features?
It could well have been. If these, anything could have been looked at the time, in hindsight,
Yeah,
and these features added.
yeah.
Can you remember at the time during discussions whether you or anyone else raised the prospect either with Butler and Young or with David Steppel or Robin Callan, it's worth considering some additional features, the trapdoor or the secondary electrical supply or water protection or anything like that?
No, because we've worked to the specification.
Now, could we look at your role as the construction director at Grenfell? And if we can go back to your witness statement, which is at APX quadruple 8766/3. It's at the very bottom of the page. You say this, I was involved in the modernisation project from an early stage. Now, holding that point in your mind, could I ask us to go to APX quadruple 5619? Now, you'll see at the very top of this page, it's described as contract documentation for the refurbishment of 2 electric passenger lifts and replacement of 1 hydraulic passenger lift at Grenfell Tower. Do you remember ever seeing this document before?
Not the contract documents, only the specification.
So if we just say, for example, go into this document, if we go over to the next page, so it's slightly further in, if we can, to get to the substance. So just stopping there, looking at that index, and we can go into the substance if you want to. The word specification crops up a lot. What appears to be the case is that although this is called the contractual documentation, it's in fact the specification. Is this something is this the document you would have been provided with, do you
Correct.
think?
Yes.
Would you ever have seen, would there ever have been a need for you to have seen the contract, for example, between RBKC and TIMO on the one hand and, say, Butler and Young or Apex on the other?
Not necessarily at that time.
Now, looking at the different areas of responsibilities, what was your understanding of Butler and Young's role in the project?
They would oversee the whole of the project from the specification to completion to ensure that we carried out the work in accordance with their specification
And what was Apex's role?
to fully comply with the works that were specified.
And if we could go to APX quadruple 5551. This is a fax dated the 6th of August 2004 from Ian Morehouse of Butler and Young to Paul Thomas. Can you help us? Who was Paul Thomas? What was his role at Apex?
Yeah, it's a jog of the memory. Paul Thomas would have been our sales engineer at the time.
And if we look down at the substance of the fax, it says, confirms that RBKC TIMO are pleased to proceed with Apex. And if we go to the penultimate paragraph at the bottom, it says start on site as a critical date. RBKC are anxious to achieve a major spend this year, and perhaps Gary can investigate on this. Can you help us as to what that comment meant?
That would be on me procuring the materials and placing the orders on our suppliers for the control system, the long lead items machine, because they come from Italy. And there would have been a 16 to 18 week leading period for this. So it would have been keen for me to get all the materials on order, obviously to fall within the borough's spending requirements.
Now, if we can turn to the specification itself, and if we go back to your witness statement, which is APX quadruple 8766/4. And this is the top of paragraph, or top of the page is continuation of paragraph 16. And the first line at the very top of this page, you say the specification was very detailed. If the specification contained anything that was unworkable in the sense of it couldn't be done or was undesirable, would those concerns be something that you would raise first of all with Butler and Young?
Not normally, because they would have been discussed during the tender stage if there was any questions with that specification. They were pretty thorough in what they asked for, Butler and Young.
And you didn't have any cause to raise any concerns?
No, I
with
wouldn't
Butler
have
and Young?
cause to raise the question in the specification.
And if I could go back to the specification, if we go to BUT quadruple 0044/20, and we look at paragraph 2A.01, and if we see 5 paragraphs down, it's the one that starts with the word "should anything," and that says this: should anything be omitted from this specification, which is fitting and usually considered necessary for due and proper completion of the work, the tenderer shall verbally bring this to the attention of the supervising officer prior to tender submission, with confirmation in the letter prior to submitting the tender return. So, looking at that, at the tender stage, if anything was missing from the specification, then Apex would have brought it to Butler and Young's attention.
They would have done.
And at what level would that have been done? Would you have raised it, or would someone higher up?
No, they've probably been with the sales team.
Now, I don't know whether you've watched the evidence last week from Mr. Ellis and Mr. Warhat.
I have.
Now, we were told that the TMO had instructed Butler and Young not to arrange for firefighting lifts to be installed. First of all, do you remember any such, or hearing of any such instruction from the TMO to Butler and Young?
No.
Is that something that you would have been informed of in the usual course?
I would imagine so, but the specification would have actually been would have said firefighting lifts, which is normal.
Put differently, do you remember any concerns or complaints being raised by TMO or RBKC that a firefighting lift had not been installed?
No, none.
Can we take it from your previous answers that neither you nor anyone at Apex had any concerns about not fitting a firefighting lift at Grenfell?
No concerns.
Did you or anyone else at Apex, to the best of your knowledge, question whether leaving lifts as firemen's lifts was compliant with relevant standards?
It was at the time.
And that's for the reasons you've given earlier on?
Yeah.
Now, if we could go back to the specification, and if we go to page 22, and we see there at paragraph 2A.05 under the heading Regulations, it says this: although it is recognised that the existing structural constraints shall prevent full compliance with harmonised European standards, the requirement is for the lift installation to include all of those items and features that do comply as far as is reasonably practicable. Now, that on its face puts you on notice, or rather refers to existing structural constraints. Were there any existing structural constraints that were relevant here?
There would have been the pit depth and the headroom.
I didn't catch the first element. I caught headroom. What was the first bit?
Pit depth.
Pit depth. Do you know whether the advice of a structural engineer was sought in relation to either or both of those topics?
No.
You don't know, or it was?
I don't know.
Do you remember hearing any reference to any advice given by a structural engineer?
No.
Could we stay within the specification but go to page 23 and paragraph 2A.06, which concerns design standards? And we'll see there it says this: the equipment and installation shall conform to this specification and to the relevant British standards, including codes of practice, and in particular BS 5655, BS 7255, and EN 81-1. Where this specification differs from those standards and codes, the provision of this specification shall prevail. Reference to British standards and codes of practice shall mean the addition current 3 months prior to the date for return of tenders. A certificate of compliance with the relevant British standards shall be provided to the supervising officer on request. Any changes during the course of the contract in the relevant British standards and the codes of practice shall be brought to the attention of the supervising officer by the contractor. It shall be understood that the existing characteristics, particularly dimensions and clearances, may not comply with current British standards, and these shall be qualified in the tender return. Now, first of all, SO's supervising officer, is that right?
That is correct. That would be Butler and Young.
And was a certificate of compliance with relevant British standards ever provided by Apex, the supervising officer?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did they ever ask you for one, to the best of your knowledge?
No, I don't think they did, no.
Was a certificate of compliance usually not given? Is it unusual not to give it?
We give the certification of compliance on a new lift, on a CE mark lift, not on a refurbished lift.
Now, could I ask you to turn...
Sorry, Mr. Poynter, I think I'm going to have to ask you to keep your voice up a bit.
Sorry.
Because the transcriber finds it quite hard sometimes to catch what the witness says.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Now, if we could stay in the specification but turn over the page to page 24 and paragraph 2A.07, we see there under the heading Related Documentation and References, the first paragraph says this: this tender documentation shall be read in conjunction with, and its requirements are in addition to, the general conditions of contract, and any drawings and other documents issued with it, and listed in this invitation to tender, and as set out below. And if we go to the very bottom of this page, and I think from memory fourth from the bottom, we have BS 5588, which is fire precautions in the design, construction and use of building. Now, BS 5588 appears on the list of standards to be read here in conjunction with the specification. Now, at first blush, its inclusion suggests that compliance with firefighting lift standards should have been considered. First of all, is that a fair reading of...
That is a fair reading, but it's not actually described within the specification, so it's not required.
And do you remember whether you or anyone else at Apex, to the best of your knowledge, when they were looking at this, when their tender was being prepared, raised whether firefighting lifts ought to have been?
No, they wouldn't have raised it because the specification didn't call for it.
And so it follows from that that, in your view at least, it was obvious that the specification did not require a firefighting lift.
That's correct.
Now, could I turn to a separate topic, which is timing or opportunity for raising any concerns that Apex may have had? And if we can go to Warren Gentner's statement, which can be found at APX *08774/5. And we see it's 4 paragraphs down from the top. It starts with the words, the preparation of the contract. And he says this: the preparation of the contract, and therefore the specification of the work, was the responsibility of BYCL, so that's Butler and Young, on the instruction of their client. Once completed and disseminated to Apex, there would be no scope for Apex to enter into any discussions regarding changes to the proposed work, design issues, and suggestion for alternative plans. And if we could just hold that in our heads and go to APX *08783/2. And you see under the heading answer, the first one of those, and if we go down to the third paragraph under that emboldened word answer, he said once awarded the contract, the site meetings would be held prior to the project starting, and any issues could have been raised with BYLC at this time. Would you agree with Mr. Gentner's observation that Apex could have raised issues with Butler and Young before the project starting?
No, they would have only concerned with the project and the specification. The meeting there they're referring to would have been anything on site issues, storage, container issues. That's what that is referring to.
So the practicalities of operation of the site.
Correct, that's what that one means.
If there were any safety concerns, again, sorry, this may be slightly repetitious, but if Apex had any safety concerns about the specification, when would those be raised?
That they wouldn't be raised. We'd follow the specification, and they will be replicated in our drawings and the issuing of the equipment. So we wouldn't question the specification.
So even if there were safety concerns?
We wouldn't read that there's safety concerns in there.
So at what level, presumably Apex, this may be a question for Mr. Jensen, thinking about it, but if there were safety concerns, presumably Apex wouldn't stay silent, it would raise them at some point.
If there is serious concerns, they will be raised, but there was the only concerns of what we're talking about now, if they were firefighting or not, and it wasn't relevant at the time, we was only working to their specification.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, there were no safety concerns raised to the best of your knowledge?
There were no safety concerns.
Can I now turn on to a separate question, which is the fire control switch and construction of the lifts? And if we could go to TMO 00853 Now, if that could be amplified. Now, it was an email sent by Robin Callan at the TMO to Ian Morehouse at Butler and Young. You can't see that, it's redacted. It was not sent to you. I'll just let you read it. Now, it refers to the type of landing door release key. Would that key have been the same as the fire control switch key?
It would have been exactly the same. It would be an express drop key.
Now, it suggests that the original Apex tender return made provision for a Euro release key rather than a drop key. Do you remember what Apex had tendered for originally?
Not originally.
Would they usually propose a Euro key?
We would do either. We would use a Euro or a drop key, depending on the specification. We can change to either.
Do you recall being asked to change the type of fire control switch key from a Euro to a drop?
We probably would have done that ourselves because of the type of building, to suggest a drop key and not a Euro key in that situation. This is not practice.
You say the type of building. Can you help the panel here? What are you referring to there?
It's because it is a borough, a council type building.
And are you referring there to security concerns?
There will be security concerns with a Euro key because everybody has access to them.
And when you say everyone has access to Euro key, you say they're readily available on the internet and other sources.
Yeah, the express key was designed as a vandal-resistant key.
Now, if we can go back to the specification, which is at BUT quadruple 0 0044/60. There we go. It's a specification on the section thereof which deals with fireman's control. Now, the switch was to be installed on the ground floor of the tower, is that right?
That is correct.
And the fireman's control switch set out in the specification is designed to be operated by an express drop release key, is that right?
That is correct.
And the relevant standards at the time required that firefighting lifts should have a fire control switch, is that right?
That is correct.
And the difference between a fireman's control switch in the specification and a fire control switch described in the relevant standards is the type of key used to operate the switch.
That is correct. There is a difference.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, a fire control switch is operated with a Euro key, which is a triangular design. Is that right?
That is correct.
And the dimensions of the Euro key are specified in the relevant standard.
That is correct.
And so the Euro key is manufactured to very specific dimensions. Is that right?
That is correct.
Were the TMO well aware that Euro keys were widely available on the internet and elsewhere?
I would imagine they would have been at the time, yes.
And was that common knowledge?
It was definitely common knowledge.
Could we go back to your witness statement, an APX quadruple 08766/16? And it's your answer to question 21. And there you say you think that the fire control switches were procured from AA Electrical. Now, there's no other documentation that I've seen that identifies the switches in terms of make and model. Is there any further detail that you can provide on fuller reflection here?
No, it's just that we would have procured that type of switch from A&A Electrical.
And AA Electrical, are they manufacturers?
They're a supplier. I believe they manufactured as well.
Do you know whether they manufactured the switches generally?
Yes, they do.
And is it likely that they were the manufacturer of the switch we're concerned with here?
That is.
Now, if we can go to page 9 in your statement, and it's little c, which is at the bottom of the page, you say this: from the drawings, only one switch was fitted to operate both lifts, as they were duplexed, as identified at section 2A.14, open brackets 2, close brackets of the specification. As they operated in this way, one fireman's switch allowed for control of both lifts. Can you explain for us how one switch operated both lifts?
Because of the lifts duplex together by the control system, they will be interlinked, so any switch that's signalled would bring both, it would actually stop the lifts where they were going, doors would remain closed. It would bring the lifts back down to the ground floor where the doors would park with the doors open, and that will give control to the fireman, whoever's activated that switch.
Was it common to install one fire control switch for two lifts?
For a duplex, yes.
Were there any advantages or indeed disadvantages to using this method of control?
No, none.
Could I turn on to the separate topic now of the commissioning of the lifts? And if we go first of all to APX quadruple 08692/28. And if we can look at the right-hand side of that document, we'll see roughly a third of the way down, parallel to the first punch hole, the box purchaser's identification number, and underneath that it says H090. Does that mean this is the testing certificate for lift H090?
That is correct.
Thank you. Now, if we could stay in this document but go to page 32, so 4 pages on, and we can see just below or just parallel to the first punch point is clause 2.9, which concerns landing door assemblies. And if we could amplify that, thank you. You'll see the first question asks, does this contract require the landing door assemblies to be fire rated? And there's no answer at all there. Can you help us as to why that particular box is not being ticked?
I can only guess that the tester at the time didn't have sight of the certificate for the door.
It says E, confirm that the fire-rated elements of the door assembly are correctly fitted. Now, would any detail of fire rating be provided afterwards if it were missing here?
It would have been, but he's ticked it, so he would have known the doors had the requirements of the fire assembly on the door. They would have had the smoke fillets in place, so he would know that they are fire doors.
We don't need to go to it, but the commissioning certificate for the other lift, so 8091, does have the box and the information, box ticked and the information provided. Would that simply mean that the documentation was ready at the time of testing?
Correct.
Now, just to complete the point, if we can go back to your witness statement, which is APX quadruple 08766/7, that's really your answer to question 7B. You say that you cannot locate any certification relating to the fire rating of the lift landing doors. Propbrook were unable to supply the certificates when requested. Would you have expected the certification to have existed originally?
Yes, they would have been. There would have been a certification for them doors.
Now, if we can go to APX quadruple 08692/42. Thank you. And it's section 14, which starts just below the first punch hole. The form indicates there that the lift was not a firefighting lift. Is that a correct reading of the document?
That is correct.
And if we look further down, we see at little g, the question requests confirmation that the emergency operations systems function correctly, and confirmation has given their yes. Is that a fair reading of that?
That is correct, yes.
Now, the form also says that the emergency operations system has not been demonstrated. We can see that at the box at the just off centre at the bottom of the page. Do you know why the emergency operations system had not been demonstrated at this time?
I can't answer that. Sorry.
Would that demonstration have included testing of the fire control switch?
That would have been demonstrated. The testers tested it, I'd imagine, but not demonstrated it.
And if we just go to page 44, we see your name in the bottom right-hand corner. Would you have been responsible for all elements of testing? I
would have signed that off on completion, yes.
And you would have satisfied yourself as the accuracy of all the answers?
Yes.
Can I now turn on to a separate topic, which is the automatic fire recall system?
Sorry, before we leave this, you haven't actually signed this document.
No, I would have signed the original. I think when they're typed out, they don't actually get to me, they get issued.
I'm just wondering whether this document's created after all the work's been done.
Yeah, it would have been done manually on site by the tester and handwritten, and then we would type it to issue it so it looks better.
All right, thank you.
Turning on to automatic fire recall system. Now, just so I can double check we're talking about the same thing. The definition I'm applying is a system which, when smoke or heat is detected, automatically recalls the lifts to a particular floor. Is that, for these purposes, as good a definition as we're going to get?
Yeah, that is correct.
Thank you. Now, before the lift works, do you know if there was an automatic fire recall system in place at Grenfell?
Not that I recall, no.
Is it right that an automatic fire recall system was not included in the specification?
I don't think it was, no.
Now, it seems to have been added at a later stage in the project, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And it seems to have been about late 2005, early 2006,
that is correct.
Right? Can you remember now why the system was added?
No, I can't recall that, sorry.
Can you remember what type of automatic fire recall system was ultimately installed?
I think from memory it would just be a recall. We'd put fault-free contacts in the machine room and that would be integrated within the system fitted by others.
Thank you. Was it connected to the building management system at all?
It would have been untested, yes.
Can you remember, was the system installed to allow the lift to comply with a particular standard or not?
That I wouldn't know.
You don't remember that as being a
No.
subject of discussion at the time?
No, not at all.
Did you test the fire recall system?
Not that I know of, but it would have. I wouldn't personally, but it would have been tested.
Do you know why the system was eventually disconnected?
No, I don't.
Can you remember that by the time of Apex's later involvement in the lift, so this is 2015, can you remember whether the recall system was functional or not?
I wouldn't know, sorry.
Can I now turn on to that second project, which is slightly more than a decade after the first one? Apex became involved in the second set of works in about 2015. Is that about right?
That's about right, yes.
Now, who was Apex's TMO contact during Project 2?
It would have been my project manager, Gary Ager.
Now, if I can ask us to go to APX quadruple 07916. If we go, turn over the page. There we go. We have a letter of intent dated the 12th of February 2015, excuse me, sent by Ryden to Apex. Can you remember now, was there a concluded written contract between Apex and Ryden?
Probably, I couldn't tell you.
Would that be something that you looked for? Is it something that concerned for other people?
Probably a concern for other people. I'd minimum involvement in Project 2.
Now, can you help us? What was Apex contracted to do during the course of Project 2?
Supply and fit the 4 new entrances and upgrade the car COP to add the extra floors in.
Now, if we can turn to page 13 of your statement, which is APX quadruple 08692 /13. Now, in response to question 12, so it's the top third of the page, you describe yourself as having, quotes, an overarching supervisory role, close quotes, in the project. What did that mean in practice?
I would have just undertook help Gary procure the materials, and basically he would look after the project.
Did you supervise Gary Ager?
Yes.
Did you require sort of constant supervision, or was it sort of occasional help you provided?
Occasional if he needed it. Gary's very competent.
Was the issue of whether the lifts were or should be firefighting lifts ever raised during Project 2, do you remember?
Not that I'm aware of.
Can I ask you now about the walkway floor switch, finally? At the time of the fire, a second fire control switch was installed on the walkway floor, but it had been disconnected. Can you assist the panel at all as to why that switch had been installed on the walkway floor?
No, I've no recollection of that at all. Sorry.
Do you know whether it was installed as part of the second project?
No, I don't.
Well, Ms. Poynter, I've come to the end of my prepared questions. Sir, might I have 10 minutes?
Usually, yes. Mr. Poynter, when counsel gets to the end of his questions, you may know this, we have to have a break to make sure that, well, to give him a chance to make sure he's asked all the questions. Occasionally something's been left out. And also to let other people who are not present in the room suggest questions that perhaps we ought to ask you before you leave. So we'll stop now until 11:05. Will that be long enough, do you think, Mr. Kinnear?
Yes.
Yes. We'll break till 11:05, and then when you come back, we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Okay.
Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. And if you go with the usher now, she'll look after you. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, 11:05 then.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Poynter to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Poynter. Well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Kinnear?
Thanks, Ian. I have no further questions for you, Mr. Poynter, so it just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending today.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Poynter, and it's right that I should thank you very much on behalf of the panel for your coming here to give evidence. It hasn't taken a lot out of your day, but it must have been a nuisance anyway, because you would have had something else to do. So we are very grateful to you. It's been helpful to hear what you have to tell us, and you're now free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Kinnear. Now, we have another witness, but we have to have the usual break, don't we, for housekeeping arrangements?
Yes, and there's a changeover at the bar as well. And
Yes.
so I don't know whether this is maybe a convenient time to take an early break. And so
We could, if we had a slightly short early break, so to speak, and said 20 past, would that give enough time for the housekeeping?
I'm sure.
And for everyone else to get organised?
I'm sure.
Right, well, we'll say 20 past 11. If you need any more time, just let us know.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Eustace. Now, I gather you've got another witness for us.
We do, yes. May I call Roger Anthony, please?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Anthony.
Good morning.
You're going to make the affirmation, I think. Is that right?
I am.
It's on the screen there. If you'd read the words out, please.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, do sit down, please. Make yourself comfortable there. Yes, when you're ready, Mr. Eustace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you please give the inquirer your full name?
Roger Anthony.
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence today. Before I start asking questions, there's a few preliminary matters I'd like to draw to your attention. If you have difficulty understanding anything I'm saying, or if my questions are excessively long and convoluted, please do let me know and I will rephrase them. If you feel that you need a break at any point, please let us know. And can I ask you to please keep your voice up and say rather than nod or shake your head to any questions I ask so the transcriber can pick up what you're saying?
Yes.
Thank you. You made a witness statement to the inquiry, and we're going to go to that now, which is APX 408780. If we turn to page 12, please. It's dated the 29th of October 2019. Is that your signature?
That's correct.
Have you read your statement recently?
Yes, I have.
Can you confirm the contents are true?
I can confirm this, or yes.
Thank you. Have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming here today?
No.
Thank you. We'll begin by asking you some questions about your employment background. If we could go, please go back to the beginning of the statement, paragraphs 3 onward. Thank you. You began working in the lifts industry in around 1982, is that right?
Correct.
And you started working at Otis Lifts as a fitter's mate and were eventually promoted up to a project manager.
Correct.
You moved to Apex around 2005 or 2006 and left in around 2007 or 2008, is that right?
As far as I can recall, yes.
And are you currently working at Pickering's Lift as a test engineer?
I am.
Can you briefly explain, please, what does a test engineer do?
Checks does the static and static tests on the lifts, the functional tests on the lifts, and the dynamic tests on the lifts to make sure it's safe and operational for the public.
Just touching on those terms briefly, for those of us who are not lift engineers, static, is that when the lift is just stood in its place and not moving?
Correct.
And dynamic?
Dynamic testing it would be the safety gear test, the buffer test, i.e. moving.
And functional?
Functional tests of functions of the lift, i.e. as in push buttons, indicators, and so on.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So overall, you worked in the lifts industry since the early 80s, so around coming up to 40 years now.
Correct.
And how would you describe your level of knowledge of the lifts industry?
Fairly knowledgeable.
Can you help us, please? How do you keep up to date with changes and developments in lifts industry and guidance and such?
It's a very good question. We're not directly told when the standards are coming out, but we are made aware through the trade that they are coming out. But the only time we see the standards is if we ask for them from the company.
Thank you, that's helpful. We'll touch on the different standards in a minute. So at Apex, you worked as a project manager. Can you explain briefly what that role entails, please?
It was mainly running modernisation projects or refurbishment projects.
And which part of the project would you be involved in? Would it be tendering or would it be the actual works?
I would get involved just before the site start, the site work start.
So someone else at Apex will sort out the preliminary
Correct.
stages, yes. And how many modernisation or refurbishment projects have you worked on before the Grenfell Tower project, please? Approximately.
Quite a few.
Great.
Yeah.
Turning to your qualifications, if we can show paragraph 6 on the next page, please. And zoom in on that, please. So some of the qualification courses you list there, I can understand what they are, but J5 and J25, are those lift engineer qualifications?
They're the lift industry qualifications from, i.e., a mate to a fitter.
And where in the third bullet point you refer to in-house, Otis delivered training, is any of that relevant to lift fire safety?
Yes.
Can you elaborate, please?
The Otis delivered training would be when I trained as a test engineer, which is, at that point I would come into contact with the standards, because we obviously have to test to British standards or EN standards.
I see. Thank you very much. And so in your role as project manager, in addition to your lift testing engineer role, would you come across British and European standards as well, or is it
Yes.
much the same? And in terms of the period before you joined APAX in about 2005, did you receive training on the principles and requirements of British Standard 5588-5, 1991, Fire Precautions in the Design, Construction and Use of Buildings, Part 5, Code of Practice for Firefighting Stairs and Lifts?
No specific training, but I am aware of that document.
So is it fair to say you were familiar with its requirements and substance?
Yes.
And if you did need to consult it in detail, is that something you would have had in your workplace or had access to otherwise?
If you're employed by a company, they would have that on file, yes.
So similar questions in relation to another standard, BS-EN 81-72-2003, Safety Rules for the Construction and Installation of Lifts, Particular Applications for Passenger and Goods Lifts, Firefighter Lifts. It's quite a long title there, but same questions. Is that one that you're familiar with?
Yes, I'm familiar with it, but no specific training.
Yes. And again, is that one you could obtain access to via your
Yes.
employer? Then another one we'll look at is BS 5588-5 2004. So this is an update to the 1991 version, which was published in November 2004. Does that ring any bells?
I haven't seen the update.
You haven't seen the update. And you mentioned when I started asking you questions about how knowledge about guidance coming out gets circulated. Would you have expected to be told by your employers or any professional organization that this has in fact come out?
Sometimes we hear of new regulations coming out, sometimes we don't. It's just if we need it, we have to obtain it from somewhere.
So is your evidence that when you were with APAX, there wasn't a structured way for you to be updated, such as new regulations this month, emails or similar? No. And finally, did you receive any training on the statutory guidance document? So that's the Secretary of State's guidance on fire safety under the building regulations, approved document B?
No specific training.
And were you aware of this document?
No.
No. In relation to firefighting lifts specifically, did you receive any other training, which you haven't mentioned already, on the design requirements of such lifts?
No specific training, no.
And what about general awareness? What was your level of knowledge about them in around 2005?
Yes, I've worked on firefighting lifts.
And when you worked on them, would it be a case of you being able to obtain the relevant documents?
Yes.
Your last question might have answered this one as well, but did you receive any training on the types of buildings in which a firefighting lift would be installed?
No specific training.
Turning now to a slightly different topic, which is your previous experience of working on high-rise residential buildings.
Yes.
Have you ever managed a lift refurbishment or modernization project in a high-rise residential building?
Yes.
And can you assist in terms of what those works generally would involve?
It was a very similar scheme to the scheme at Grenfell Tower.
And so it was, can you give us any details about the building in question?
Yes, it was Barbican Estate, the 3 tower blocks on the Barbican Estate.
And did it involve any a replacement of the lifts,
Yes.
new lifts being put in?
Yes, a very similar scheme.
And what was the result of that scheme? Were firefighting lifts put in as the result or not?
No, because it was classed as a refurbishment.
Now, a few questions about your professional background in relation to some of the participants in this project. The tenant management organization, which operated Grenfell Tower, did you work with them prior to Grenfell Tower project? And whilst you were working with the TMO in the tower, or on the tower project, did you have much contact with the TMOs?
As I say, my involvement started just shortly before we started on site. So we would have project meetings fortnightly to start with, and then I think it was monthly, if I recall.
And was your experience of any TMO staff dealing with lifts you came across that they had awareness of the British and European requirements for lifts?
No.
And was there anyone in particular that springs to mind when you answer that?
I can't recall anybody having knowledge of the regulations at the meeting.
A gentleman called Robin Killarn, who was employed at TMO, is that someone you came across?
I can't recall if he sat at the meetings that I attended.
And David Staple?
No, I never met.
Okay, thank you. So the next set of questions I'm going to ask you about is about your specific role at Grenfell Tower. So you've explained the role of the project manager, and now we're going to focus on the relationship between different parties in that project. What was Butler & Young's role in the project, please?
They were the consultants, the lift consultants for the projects.
And what was Apex's role?
Apex were carrying out the works on Grenfell on the lifts.
So is it right that Butler & Young produced a specification to which
Yes.
you worked? At paragraph 14 of your statements, page 3, please, if we can turn that up. And amplify it, please. You say, I was the project manager at the time. I was not involved in the procurement of the work, nor the costing or tendering. My first engagement would have been in relation to the planning of the labour for the job and timescales for site works. Thereafter, dealing with consultants' issues, attending consultants' meetings, site monitoring, testing, snagging, and handover. I mean, these are all matters you were just telling us
Correct.
about. Yes.
Yeah.
So when you refer there to consultants' issues, who do you mean and what are the issues?
If we found anything on site that would maybe not comply to specification, we would get in touch with a consultant and discuss.
And did that happen at all frequently?
Not to my recollection.
Was, so you mentioned here in your evidence, meetings held between Apex and Butler & Young. Was the design of the lifts ever discussed at those meetings?
No. When I say meetings, we would have on-site meetings probably fortnightly.
Yes. And during those meetings, there was no discussion of design?
No.
If you did have any concerns, comments, or suggestions about the lift design within the specification, is that something you feel you could have raised with Butler & Young?
Could have raised, yes.
And if there were any safety concerns specifically with the proposal, is that something you felt able to raise?
Yes, definitely.
And in your past experience of different projects, did you ever raise such issues?
No, because the consultant specification is normally pretty good.
Well, we'll discuss the specification now. So paragraph 17 of your statement, we don't need to go to. You say that part of your role was ensuring Apex carried out the works in accordance with the Butler & Young specification. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
So would it be fair to say that as far as you saw your role, it was to follow the letter of that specification?
Yeah, exactly.
Can we please go to BUT 6044, page 23? It's BUT 604423. Thank you. And just zoom in on the bottom part of that page, please. So, the design standards, 2A06, the equipment and installation shall conform to the specification and to the relevant British standards, including scope of practice, and in particular, BS 5655, 7255, and EN 81.1. Where this specification differs from those standards and codes, the provision of the specification shall prevail. reference to the British standards and codes shall mean the addition occurring 3 months prior to the date for the return of the tenders. A certificate of compliance with the relevant British standards shall be provided to the SO, that's supervising officer,
Yes.
on request. Any changes during the course of the contract in the relevant British standards and codes of practice shall be brought to the attention of the SO by the contractor. So SO here is Butler and Young, is that right?
Correct.
It shall be understood that the existing characteristics, particularly dimensions and clearances, may not comply with current British standards, and these shall be qualified in the tender return. So, going back to what we just read out, the final sentence of the first paragraph says that if there's any disagreement between the standards and the specification, the provision of the specification will win out effectively. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
And is that the basis on which you would have operated as part of the project?
Yes.
In the second paragraph, we read about the certificate of compliance, which shall be provided on request. As far as you're aware, did Butler and Young request a certificate of compliance?
Certificate of compliance relates to new lifts.
I see. So, but this specification was in relation to this particular project, wasn't it?
It was.
And from your witness statement, your evidence is that it wasn't a new lift.
It was not a new lift, no.
Now, in those circumstances, did you have any cause to ask why is this in here at all?
None.
So your evidence that no certificate was requested or provided, is that right?
As far as I recall, no.
Can we please go to page 24, next page over. There's a section there, 2A07, related documentation and references. Reading the introductory paragraph, the standard documentation shall be read in conjunction with, and its requirements are in addition to the general conditions of contract and any drawings and other documents issued with it and listed in the invitation to tender as set out below. And if we look at the bottom, fourth entry from the bottom, please. BS 5588, fire precautions in design, construction, and use of building. And as we've seen earlier, one of the BS 5588 standards is to do with firefighting lifts, yes?
Correct.
So this regulation, or the British standard, appeared in the list of standards to be read in conjunction with the specification. Does that suggest that compliance with firefighting lift standards should have been considered by APAX in its work?
Not on a refurbishment, no.
And can you expand on that, please? Why not?
You would have constraints, building constraints, to comply fully with the firefighting lift.
And what building constraints in this particular project did you have to deal with?
Water dispersal, two methods of. You need secondary power supplies, intercom systems.
And would any, in your experience, would any of those features have been would have been insurmountable in this case?
Well, insurmountable. To get the water dispersal off the landings would, in my opinion, have been a big task.
So, appreciating it's been a long time since these events occurred, but to the best of your recollection, was the viability or reasonable practicability of these features ever discussed or considered amongst the project?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, those particular features, the possibility of putting them into the lifts, was that ever discussed either internally in APAX or externally with Butler and Young?
I wasn't part of those discussions, I can't say.
In your witness statement, you describe this as a major project.
Yes.
In fact, without going into the detail, much of the machinery of the lifts was replaced, in effect, yes?
Yes.
Do you agree that it would have provided an opportunity to consider upgrading the lifts to have the features of the firefighting lift as far as reasonably practicable?
I mean, it could be done, but it wouldn't comply. It couldn't be called a firefighting lift. The test engineer couldn't sign it off as a firefighting lift. And a firefighting lift, if I recall correctly, has to serve every floor. And I think at the time, Grenfell, there was 2 floors that the lift didn't serve at that time.
Yes. And does that relate only to residential floors or any floors?
Not sure. I think it's residential.
Thank you. Well, the inquiry will be hearing from Mr. Hawkins, an expert. So
Yeah, I'm not sure on that point.
Thank you. So you say at paragraph 15 of your statement, we don't need to go to it, that you read the specification before you started work. Did you suggest, or anyone else within Apex, to your knowledge, the lifts at Grenfell Tower perhaps should either be firefighting lifts outright or have more features of firefighting lifts?
Firefighting lifts outright.
So my question was whether anyone suggested that firefighting lifts should be put in. Is your answer that someone did suggest?
I can't remember anybody suggesting that.
The evidence from the Butler and Young author of the specification, Ian Morehouse, last week was that the TMO provided specific instruction to Butler and Young not to consider the feasibility of installing firefighting lifts, and the specification was drafted accordingly. Were you aware of that instruction
No.
from the TMO? So it's not something that was discussed
I wasn't
internally?
involved in those discussions, no.
Thank you. If I can...
Mr. Anthony, I'm going to interrupt just for a moment. I know you're keen to give us your evidence, and we're very keen to hear it, but it would help if you could let counsel finish his question before you respond, because it's difficult to transcribe if people are talking at the same time.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's all right. I understand, but that would help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So if you weren't aware of that instruction, do you agree that Apex, as a lifts contractor, should have raised the issue to at least discuss it of whether the lift should be firefighting lifts or at least have more features of a lift?
Not at that time. I mean, I've never seen a fully compliant firefighting lift in any local authority building, to this day, actually. So why would it be different at Grenfell? I don't know.
Is your evidence then that it's more likely to find a firefighting lift in a non-local authority building?
I don't know if that's the case, but in my experience, I have never seen a fully compliant firefighting lift in a local authority building.
And just for our enlightenment, is that because there are particular features which local authorities are not keen on, or were they just different
It
reasons?
could be. I don't know the details, but I can only tell this inquiry what I've seen in it
Quite.
through experience.
Yeah. I just wondered whether there was something common to all the lifts that you'd seen in local authorities.
They follow a pretty standard specification, most of them.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.
Thank you. I will ask Mr. Operator to go to Mr. Hawkins' expert report, which is at RHO 703 at page 143. And zooming in on the bottom paragraph, please, which I'll just read out. If you follow along, Mr. Anthony, just in fairness to give you an opportunity to comment on what Mr. Hawkins says there. My view, based on good industry practice, that Apex, first as a tender for the contract and then as a subcontractor, had a duty to inform Butler and Young the specification did not comply with the relevant codes and standards. It's likely that the first appropriate point at which this should have been raised was the initial site visit as part of the tendering process, and you explained you weren't involved in that.
No.
Had it not been raised at this point, it should have been raised subsequently, for example, once Apex was awarded the contract. Ideally, this would have been in writing or would have been documented in the minutes of the meetings. In relation to the second part of that, involving sort of post-tender work, do you agree or disagree with his assessment?
That they could fit parts of a firefighting lift?
That it was good industry practice for Apex.
It was.
No, sorry, just a minute. I think the point that Council's asking you to consider that being made here is that Apex should have drawn the attention of Butler and Young to the fact that this would not comply with current standards. Is that right, Mr. Houston?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With current standards, as in firefighting standards?
Yes.
No, it wouldn't have complied.
No, but the question is, should Apex have said something to Butler and Young to say,
No,
you realise this isn't going to comply with current standards?
Not really, because Butler and Young would have had that discussion with the client. So once the specification is set, then we follow the specification.
If I understand your evidence, Mr. Anthony, once you see the specification, you made the assumption that it's already been dealt with. Is that
Yes.
what you're saying? And in your general experience, it's a variation on the question I asked you in relation to safety issues, but have you ever told lift consultants or clients on previous projects that the specification didn't comply with the relevant standards for lifts?
Clients sometimes, rarely consultants.
Is that because you assume consultants to have more knowledge of
Yes.
what those are? Turning to a different topic now, the fire control switch. If we can please go to BUT 6044 at page 60. So this section of the specification deals with a fireman's control switch. Is it right that this switch was to be installed on the ground floor at Grenfell Tower?
Yeah, which was the fire service access level.
Yes. And the control switch set out in the specification is designed to be operated with an express drop release key.
Correct.
And we've heard evidence from Butler and Young last week that the TMO had specifically requested the fireman switch was operable with that type of key. Were you aware of that?
I was, yes.
And what information were you given about that, please?
About the key,
About the decision that it must be an express drop key.
it's standard practice on local authority lifts to use that key.
The relevant
At
standard.
that time, sorry. At that time, sorry.
Yes, and has that changed now?
I believe some have gone to the triangle key.
So when you refer to the triangle key, the relevant standards at the time required the switch to be operated by Euro key, which is a
Well,
triangular.
that's the triangle key, yes.
Yes, Mr. Anthony, I'm sorry to remind you again. If you could just wait until I finish my question, please. Thank you. So that's the dimensions of that triangle key, unlike an express drop key, are specified in the regulations, aren't they?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, the dimensions of the Euro triangular key are written out in the regulations.
Yes.
What was the concern, as far as you're aware, of using that type of key, as you said, in a local authority building?
The triangle key.
No, the express drop key.
The express drop key was used in nearly all local authority buildings at that time.
Yes, I apologize. It's entirely my bad, Mr. Anthony. I meant to ask, what was the concern about using the triangular Euro key in local authority buildings?
I believe at that time they were quite easily available.
The inquiries received evidence from a firefighter who bought three of the express drop keys from eBay. Were you aware at the time that about their availability online or to be accessed in that way?
Not at that time, no.
Did you express any concerns to the TMO about the choice of that express drop key, or was it just standard practice?
No, I didn't express any concerns at all.
Turning next to the issue of how the works themselves went day to day. Paragraph 19 of your statement, if we can go to that, please, on page 4. You say, as far as I can recall, the project ran smoothly and delivery was to schedule. We're just going to look at some documents from that time describing the works. If we go to APX 405627, please. If we zoom in on the top half, please, we can see it's a letter from Steve Ellis at Butler & Young to Warren Gentner at Apex. And first paragraph, I'll read out for you. It is with a certain amount of sadness and a great deal of frustration that I'm obliged to send your company the attached certificate of non-completion, something I have had to do only twice before during my 15 years as a consultant. Are you familiar with that letter?
No.
No. Were there some problems in the running of the project?
There'll always be problems on a major project on this scale, but from memory, I can't recall anything too drastic, to be quite honest.
Well, we'll look at a document which may help jog your memory, which is APX 6093, please. And this is a response from Warren Gentner on 13th of January 2006 to Steve Ellis, detailing a number of problems. If we could scroll down just a bit, please, so we can see more of the text. It refers First of all, is this a ladder that you've seen before?
No.
Well, I'm going to ask you about some of the particular issues mentioned there. So first is access to the building is very restricted.
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
And then there is a reference in the middle of the page, beginning with, it was decided that we would have to devise a revolutionary method of moving the guides to accommodate the new 12-person lift installation. The method finally agreed in hindsight was time-consuming and labor-intense, although, as with all new systems, the works became easier on the second lift. Does that sound familiar at all?
Yes.
And can you explain what those issues were, please?
Sorry?
Well, what was the issue with using this new guide rail? Or this,
The guide rails had to be relocated to accommodate the new car, which would have meant complete scaffolding of the lift shaft to move them.
So, looking at these documents, do you accept that the project doesn't seem to have run smoothly and to schedule, as you said?
These are quite standard problems on this job this size.
Okay. And the lifts had to be refurbished with residents still living in the tower. Did that affect the options available to you doing the works?
Yeah, that was quite restrictive, but it's normal practice on the local authority lifts.
I'm now going to turn to the issue of commissioning of lifts. Paragraph 18 of your statement, which is page 3. Have a look at that, please. Thank you. And thank you very much. Once the works were completed, I tested one of the lifts as Apex's normal tester was unavailable at the time.
Correct.
Copy of the test certificate is attached, marked exhibit, and there's a number there. Just for the transcript, that number has a typo in it. It should end in a 2. A test of a lift involved all static and dynamic tests of the lift equipment and functions. So, picking up on that, why did you test only one of the 2 lifts?
Because Apex's normal tester was available for the second lift, so he tested the second lift. I believe he was on holiday at the time that the first lift came up for testing.
Well, we'll have a look at the relevant documentation. If we can go to APX 408692, page 65, please. Thank you. And we can see if we can enlarge the top half, please. That it's on the right there under purchaser identification number. It says H091. Yes.
Correct.
Is that the lift that?
That's the lift number.
That's the lift you dealt with.
Yes.
Can you explain briefly, please, the sort of test that you would do within the static, dynamic, functional framework while commissioning a lift?
It will take a while to go through the test sheet.
I see. Well, focusing on the ones which have to do with fire safety in particular.
Fire safety, you would check the landing doors, where all the elements were correctly fitted for the fire rating, as in smoke fillets and the door brackets, the extra door brackets, to stop, to try and prevent the buckling of the frame if it was under fire conditions. Apart from that, it's just the fire controls on the ground.
We'll look at the relevant parts of the certificate in a minute. Can we please go to page 69 of the same document? And focusing on section 2.9 near the middle of the page there. You mentioned in your answer just now the landing door assemblies, and it says that does the contract require the landing door assemblies to be fire rated? Yes. If yes, what is the fire rating requirement? 2 hours. Is the test certificate available in an order? Yes. If yes, and the doors are manually operated, is the means of fire prevention a fusible link not applicable? So can you explain, please, what that means in practice? How would you test that or check that?
It's basically a visual check, as you inspect the inside of the landing entrances from the car top to make sure all the elements of the fire-rated doors were fitted.
And did you check at that time any test certification or documentation to do with the doors?
No, being project manager for the job, I knew at that time that they were being independently assessed for the fire certificate for the 2-hour rating.
So when you ticked yes to is the test certificate available and in order, you didn't actually have the.
I didn't know. But as I say, being the project manager for the contracts, I knew the doors were being fire rated. I think it was Warrington's. I can't remember who it was.
Can we turn to page 80, please? And zoom in on the bottom half, please. And scroll down just a little bit, please, so we can see the whole of the box at the bottom. So the form there, we can see in the next to the two boxes, says that the emergency operation system was demonstrated to Steve Ellis at Butler and Young.
Correct.
And emergency operation system, what are the components to that system, please?
The emergency operation system would be the fire control.
So it is just another word for the fire control. And how would you have tested that fire control switch?
Well, by turning the switch at the ground floor. We would normally turn the switch when the cars were travelling in the up direction to make sure that it stopped at the next available floor. The doors did not open and they would return to the fire service access level, at which point the fire service could take control of the lifts.
And the inquiries heard evidence that this was a duplex system, so there
Correct.
was one switch for two
Correct.
lifts. Are you able to recall when you activated the switch, did both come down?
Both lifts came down. Sorry, no, they wouldn't have done it at that time. I did the first lift. No, it was just that one.
Because the second one was still
It's
being
still
worked.
under construction,
I
yes.
see. And what key did you use to activate the fire control switch at that time?
It would have been an express drop key.
Are you able to say where it would have been obtained from, manufactured, sold by?
It would have been obtained from Lift Components Limited, which is the only company that supplied that key.
And is that something you would have obtained via Apex?
Yes.
Thank you. And just a final reference in this document, page 82, please. That's the end of the certificate. Is that your signature at the bottom?
It is.
And on the next page, please. And there as well, yes?
Yes.
Just a few final questions to do with the automatic fire recall system. The inquiry heard evidence from Mr. Alice at Butler and Young last week that there was a system of that nature installed as part of the works that we're discussing here, or the shortly following it. Do you recall that?
No, it was. I think that that was after the works that were finished. That was installed.
And that wasn't in the specification? No. Do you have any knowledge as to whether the system was disconnected? If so, by whom and when?
No.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, those are the end of my pre-prepared questions.
Oh, right. Well, Mr. Anthony, when counsel says he's got to the end of his questions, we always have a short break to first of all, to give him a chance to check that he's not actually missed anything out, and also to give other people who aren't here a chance to suggest additional questions that perhaps we ought to ask you. So we'll have a break now. How long do you think, Mr. Eustace? 10 minutes, long enough?
That'll be fine, thank you.
We'll say 12:10, and then when you come back, we'll see if there are any more questions we need to ask you.
Thank you.
While you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it. If you'd like to go with the usher, she'll look after you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, 12:10, then, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Anthony to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Anthony, well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr. Eustace?
No more questions, Mr. Chairman, which leaves me to thank you, Mr. Anthony, for your time and assistance today.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Anthony, thank you very much indeed for coming to give your evidence. We haven't taken a lot out of your morning, but it's probably ruined your day. You've probably had something else to do. But it's been very helpful to hear from you. So we are very grateful to you for coming along. And now you're free to go.
Thank you.
If you go with the usher, she'll look after you. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Eustace. I think we have another witness on the programme, don't we? But he's not perhaps yet ready, is that right?
That's my understanding, Mr. Chairman, yes. Mr. Wallis.
And he was asked to be here for 2 o'clock, is that right?
Yes.
Right, well, in that case, we'll break now and we'll resume at 2 o'clock when we shall look forward to seeing the next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good, thank you very much. 2 o'clock, please.